introduce our distinguished panelists. Et ensuite, je dirai quelques mots d'introduction avant de lancer le débat sur la thématique donc, de Syrie, Irak, Libye, Yémen, comment relancer les États faillis. Well, in my left side, Mr. Hasni Abidi, which is director of the CERMAM, Centre d'études et de recherche sur le monde arabe et méditerranéen. À sa gauche, Enes Gomati, which is from Libya, chairman and founder of SADC Institute. Thank you. Dania Greenfield, which is deputy director from Rafik Hariri Center for the Middle East. Thank you, Dania, for joining us. Mr. Mark Hellenbogen, that you heard earlier. He is from chairman of Global Panel Foundation. And Mr. Goran Lennmarker from Sweden, I guess, chairman of the governing board, CIPRI, in Stockholm. Thank you very much to join us and to accept this invitation. I want to thank the organization, Brahim Fassiferi, Amin Amara, and Tala Salahuddin, to give us the opportunity to discuss about this subject. I'm going to switch in French. Donc nous allons évoquer la question de ces pays qui ont sombré dans la guerre civile, qui sont l'Irak, le Yémen et la Syrie, juste après ce concept qui est devenu très à la mode et qu'on a appelé le printemps arabe, et dont on voit bien qu'il n'a pas apporté pour le moment ni les réponses institutionnelles ou sociales que réclamaient les populations, et qui, en plus, débouche aujourd'hui sur des guerres fratricides qui ne nous donnent pas à voir, à moyen terme, des perspectives politiques qui tendraient à reconstruire des États avec des institutions légitimes et qui seraient basées sur le droit. Alors tout à l'heure, je ne sais pas si vous avez pu participer au panel ou entendu ce que disait Saïd Arakat. J'ai trouvé ça assez pertinent, mais en même temps pas bas. Je trouvais que c'était très très lucide, hein, en disant que ce serait long, que ce serait malheureusement, mais ça l'est déjà, sanglant, mais que finalement le changement est inévitable. Donc la perspective de ce changement et de cette reconstruction des États arabes sur des nouvelles bases est aujourd'hui une perspective qu'on doit intégrer dans nos têtes, mais qui se fera sur le long terme. Et la question principale, parce qu'il ne suffit pas de faire la guerre, surtout une guerre civile, en se disant qu'on doit accoucher d'autre chose, il faut en même temps, et c'est je crois peut-être la grande difficulté, se donner les moyens de faire en sorte que les 2 ou 3 générations qui vont venir après nous auront les moyens éducatifs, sociaux et politiques de construire de nouveaux États et des nations un peu plus harmonieuses que celles dans lesquelles nous avons vécu depuis 50 ou 60 ans, depuis les indépendances. Et c'est probablement, de mon point de vue, et c'est en cela que je trouve que Saïd Arakat était pertinent et très lucide, la grande difficulté, cette question de comment on prépare l'avenir, et est-ce que ces générations qui vont vivre dans la guerre, ces 2 ou 3 générations qui vont vivre dans la guerre, auront intégré que ces changements, ça passe par le débat, par la contradiction et par la construction d'un état de droit. Est-ce qu'on va pouvoir leur transmettre des concepts positifs alors qu'ils n'auront connu que la violence? Voilà, ce sont des questions que je lance ici à l'auditoire, mais également à nos panélistes. Et je m'arrête là pour donner la parole à Hasni Abidi. Merci Hasni.
Merci. Merci à vous. À mon tour de remercier les organisateurs de m'avoir invité encore une fois ici à Tanger. D'autant plus, je suis content que le Maghreb est présent à travers Kader, moi et Agnès. Et je pense qu'il est utile de rappeler que le Maroc, quand même, évolue dans son environnement naturel, qui est le Maghreb, et que l'intégration, en tout cas régionale, reste, pour moi, en tant que chercheur, mais en tant que ressortissant de ce grand Maghreb, non pas un objectif, mais une priorité absolue. Et comme vous le savez, dans les sciences politiques, on peut procéder à un changement par le haut, mais on peut aussi procéder à un changement par le bas. L'intégration régionale peut jouer un rôle très, très, très important dans la démocratisation. Il est très difficile de répondre ou dresser un bilan un peu sur ces États dits des États faillis, ou comme on dit en arabe, j'aime bien le mot parce qu'il est très fort, doul al-fashila, donc en quelques minutes. Mais je pourrais vous dire déjà d'emblée que la violence, en tout cas, qui est un point commun dans ces pays que vous avez cités, la violence est souvent l'échec de la politique. On passe à la violence quand la politique échoue, quand la négociation échoue, quand l'intégration échoue, quand la justice sociale n'est plus à l'ordre du jour. Et donc, le mode opérationnel, ou le langage, en tout cas, qui s'impose après l'échec de la politique, c'est évidemment la violence comme un mode de revendication et parfois même comme un mode de communication entre le gouverneur et les gouvernés. Je dis toujours que ces pays, en tout cas les pays dits du printemps arabe, connaissent une transition, mais la transition, elle a un ennemi très connu, c'est un ennemi difficile et redoutable, c'est l'impatience, être impatient. Pendant plus de 30 ans, nous avions des régimes autoritaires qui ont tout fait, non pas pour construire des institutions et des États, le mot a été dit, mais comment peut-on survivre? Comment survivre? Évidemment, comment survivre? La protection du régime et la survie du régime ne va pas de pair avec la construction d'un État, la construction des institutions. Et c'est pourquoi, quand cet État échoue justement à répondre aux demandes de la population, la justice sociale, l'intégration en négociation, évidemment, c'est le régime lui-même qui est dans une situation très difficile. Et évidemment, cet échec de pouvoir qui a résisté pendant plusieurs années avec des moyens coercitifs, avec des outils un petit peu qui sont plus acceptés par la population, la sortie d'un régime autoritaire vers un régime de transition, appelons-le un régime pluraliste, un régime plus ouvert, n'est pas du tout un processus mécanique. Cette sortie de le régime autoritaire a besoin de beaucoup de temps. Elle a besoin d'un personnel politique, administratif, et on l'a bien vu en Tunisie et en Libye. Mais où est ce personnel rompu aux techniques justement de la sortie du régime autoritaire? Il n'existe pas. Donc il fallait absolument non seulement faire ce virage d'une manière douce, veiller à ce qu'il y ait un personnel politique administratif, ce qui explique la sortie de Nahda, ou en tout cas cette sortie intelligente à mon avis, parce que Nahda a montré qu'elle n'était pas en tout cas apte, qu'elle n'avait pas le personnel ni la culture pour gérer la transition en Tunisie. Et ce qui explique d'ailleurs certaines défaillances dans d'autres pays. Donc voilà d'abord pour l'impatience, ou disons que pour dire que en quelques années, sortir du régime, en tout cas de Ali Abdallah Saleh, et là je reviens à ces États-là, et la Syrie, partons de l'idée que vous avez des pays qui ont des profils différents et qui ont des parcours différents. Et donc c'est pourquoi, disons qu'aujourd'hui la photographie n'est pas la même pour ce régime. On peut tous les qualifier, l'Irak, la Syrie, le Yémen, la Libye, des États faillis, mais évidemment, ils ont des spécificités tout à fait différentes. Aujourd'hui, la violence qui caractérise ces États, pour une raison, en tout cas, une des raisons plus importantes, c'est que l'appareil sécuritaire, et je peux vous dire que Alain Roquier a passé pendant 20 ans, il a passé sa vie en Amérique latine pour voir comment les pays d'Amérique latine ont découvert, ont embrassé un régime pluraliste après un régime autoritaire. Et il dit, dans son livre « À l'ombre des dictatures », qu'il y a deux systèmes qui s'effondrent à la sortie d'un régime autoritaire. Le premier, c'est la justice, et le deuxième, c'est la sécurité. Et du coup, les gens deviennent tout de suite nostalgiques, ils disent « Mais qu'est-ce qu'on était bien avant ?» Pourquoi? Parce que le système de la sécurité et de la justice ont été conçus autour de la figure, autour du régime, de la survie et la protection du régime. Quand ce régime tombe, ces deux systèmes tombent. Et si deux systèmes tombent là, on a l'impression que l'État s'effondre, parce que l'État n'a été que sécuritaire. Et ce qui montre un petit peu, on voit très bien dans le cas syrien, le lien très important entre le régime de Bachar et les services de renseignement et l'armée. Et on l'a bien vu avec les brigades de sécurité dans le régime de Kadhafi. Et on voit bien aussi en Irak avec la guerre, même si vous voyez un autre cas de figure, parce que là, il y a une intervention militaire, mais évidemment la chute de l'armée qui était le seul socle d'intégration. L'armée irakienne et le parti basse étaient les deux moyens d'intégration. Je vais me faire violence et faire vite pour faire le tableau. Le Yémen, vous connaissez, le Yémen, c'est un cas aussi très important où le tribal, bien sûr, se marie aussi avec un appareil sécuritaire très important qui était dominé par Ali Abdullah Saleh et par ses cousins et par ses neveux et ses enfants. Et évidemment, malgré l'intervention internationale et surtout du Conseil de coopération du Golfe, aujourd'hui, le Yémen a de la peine, malgré cette transition, a de la peine à retrouver une stabilité parce que, disons que ce régime autoritaire qui a été façonné pendant 40 ans sur le lien très fort, intime, entre l'appareil sécuritaire et l'État ne peut pas disparaître du jour au lendemain. Donc, vous voyez à peu près que l'appareil sécuritaire est un élément important. Aujourd'hui, tous les spécialistes de la transition politique, quand on parle, ils vous disent la justice transitionnelle. La justice transitionnelle, et d'autres l'appellent la justice de réconciliation, passe par deux choses. Passe bien entendu par la lutte contre l'impunité, mais elle passe par la réforme des services de sécurité de la justice. C'est très important. Le Premier ministre tunisien, tout à l'heure, il a dit la police est un élément important. Il fallait absolument que la police change ou quitte cette politique de protection du régime plutôt à la protection de la population. Je finirai par un mot pour dire que cette situation chaotique qui se présente à nous, même si personnellement, je ne suis pas surpris que ça prenne une dimension, j'allais dire, militaire, puisqu'on a radicalisé l'opposition. Elle s'est radicalisée par la radicalisation du régime, parce qu'il y avait une militarisation aussi de l'opposition. Mais elle nous offre finalement une belle leçon. Et je dis toujours à mes étudiants que nous avons la chance d'assister à un laboratoire en changement et en transition inédit dans le monde, ce qui se passe dans le monde arabe. Mais d'autres pays doivent absolument, je parle bien sûr de l'Algérie, et je parle d'autres pays, ce qu'on appelle souvent des changements ou des soulèvements en attente, ou des révolutions en attente. C'est-à-dire que la violence ou le changement par le bas, qui n'est pas forcément réfléchi, qui n'a pas de programme politique, qui peut amener le pays à la ruine, il peut être évité si la classe politique, si les dirigeants, même s'ils sont dirigeants autoritaires, peuvent à un moment donné décider d'aller vers quoi? L'intégration de tous les acteurs politiques, plus de justice sociale, bref, une bonne gouvernance. On peut éviter des changements où le printemps arabe ne passe pas forcément par des soulèvements populaires et par une radicalisation d'opposition et une islamo-militarisation. Il peut passer par un courage, par une dose de changement imposée, voulue par le régime quitte en place et ensuite passer un petit peu. Et je dirais même qu'un régime autoritaire a plus de chances de réussir une intégration ou une transition que d'autres, parce qu'il a au moins l'acceptation, il a les moyens coercitifs, il a probablement aussi les moyens financiers pour commencer cette transition, pour éviter un changement qui pourrait être fatal pour l'État lui-même. Et là, on est vraiment le monde arabe aujourd'hui, il est entre une transition et une implosion. Et l'idéal, c'est d'arriver un petit peu à un chemin entre une transition, comme on appelle une transition encadrée, pour éviter un petit peu à ce que les frontières sautent et à ce que l'État lui-même, dans sa structure, soit menacé. Et je vous remercie.
Merci Hassan. On est entré de plein pied, c'était l'objectif d'ailleurs, c'est pour ça que je remercie Hassir Hasni, dans le débat et la question centrale qui est celle de la transition. Comment on sort de ces régimes autoritaires pour tenter de construire et d'aller vers autre chose? C'est la question centrale Il y a différentes expériences, d'autres qui sont en voie peut-être de succès, on verra bien comment la Tunisie évolue, d'autres dont on voit qu'elles sont encore dans un sas, pour prendre une expression un peu neutre, et puis d'autres, comme la Syrie, comme l'Irak, comme le Yémen, qui sont carrément, ou la Libye, dont on va nous parler dans un instant, NS, qui ont basculé dans le chaos. Donc, toutes ces questions sont des questions importantes, mais personne n'y était préparé, et certainement pas les régimes qui ont eu à faire face à ce genre de situation, parce qu'elles n'ont jamais imaginé, avec une forme de complaisance aussi de l'Occident, de l'Europe ou de l'Amérique du Nord, qu'ils étaient là pour toujours. Donc on a cassé les structures intermédiaires et on n'avait plus de médiation entre la population et les gouvernants. Donc on est aujourd'hui dans ce genre de situation. C'est assez pénible. Est-ce qu'il y a quelqu'un de l'organisation là? Amine? Non. Bon, on va essayer de continuer le débat. Je crois que c'est surtout compliqué pour les traducteurs parce qu'on entend beaucoup cette grue. Je suis désolé. Donc, je vais donner la parole à Dania Greenfield. Thank you, Dania, for joining us. I just want to ask you, first of all, what is your feeling about those failed countries that we just Hasni talked earlier? Thank you very much, Dania.
Thank you, and thank you to Amadeus Institute for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here and to have this discussion with such distinguished panelists, so I look forward to our exchange. I'll respond to your question and speak a little bit about the region as a whole and the role of external actors, the United States and Europe and international organizations in trying to address that central question of how do we move from this stage to the next. But I'll also speak a little bit about Yemen in particular as a case study, a country where I've spent quite a lot of time and I think offers a very interesting example. But I do want to just echo the fact that this is a long-term process and it will take quite some time, and we will most likely see many setbacks, 2 steps forward and maybe 1 step back. But there are many who would view what's happening in the region from the outside and see deterioration in Yemen and Libya and sectarian violence in Syria and Iraq, and resurgent authoritarianism in Egypt as the death knell for democracy in the Arab world. And I think that that's quite misguided, and we need to remind those in our circles that in fact this will be a long-term process and we need to have patience on it. I think part of what the mistake has been is that we have not focused enough on core principles, and instead we've tried to pick winners and throw support behind the group that we think will offer the greatest degree of stability and advance the interests, in the case of the United States, the interests of the US or the interests of European countries. And instead, we need to return really to what those core principles are. And the word democracy has become a bit of a dirty word that maybe is not the most useful, but I would talk about the core components of the peaceful rotation of power, inclusive and equal participation of citizens, and accountability for elected and appointed representatives. And that the international community should really be focusing on how to help foster inclusive, pluralistic political systems and good governance. These are the 2 core elements that are delivering for their people, and less so on elections. I think we've missed a number of opportunities by being too focused on elections and the outcome in these very tenuous and fragile moments, and not focused enough on the core principles. And I would echo one that you mentioned that I very much appreciate, which is reform of the security services and the internal security sector reform that needs to happen, that often hasn't. In a case like Libya, in Iraq, in Yemen, this really goes to the core of the issue. And I think that we have often not paid enough attention on these. In general, I would say also that the international response has been very short-term, reactionary, and crisis-driven, and that unless we take a step back to look at these particular situations where we might have misassessed or misunderstood or had misaligned programs and policy initiatives with what was actually happening on the ground. Unless we do that assessment, we will continue to be stuck in this crisis-driven, reactionary way of responding. Syria and Iraq is a perfect case in point. And what we need to do is to take a far more strategic, long-term approach that looks at things far more holistically and builds coalitions around that. I'll use the story or the case of Yemen, I think, to illustrate a couple key elements. One thing that I would just point out is that this process of change, the Arab Spring, the Arab awakening that happened in 2011 in Yemen, did not cause the collapse of state institutions, didn't prompt these to evaporate. The reality is that the central government never had complete control over the totality of its territory, and state institutions had long been weak. They were not absent, but they were weak. And I think what changed in that period of time was that the expectations of what people wanted and what they were willing to tolerate changed. So the idea of a culture of impunity, the lack of dignity, the lack of economic opportunity, these kinds of things that people had been suffering from, they were simply no longer willing to tolerate that. And this is really what drove thousands of Yemenis, as in other countries, to pour into the streets. I would also note that the example of Yemen, I think, demonstrates actually what can be gained through an inclusive process of national dialogue, and also what the potential gaps or shortcomings of that process would be. Yemen actually can boast the only peaceful transfer of power from former President Ali Abdullah Saleh to his then vice president, and a national unity government that was put in place with 50% of the positions occupied by the former ruling party and 50% by the so-called opposition coalition. And this set in place a 2-year process, meant to be 2-year process, of a national dialogue, followed then by constitution drafting, which is what is currently underway, then leading eventually to elections. The positive part of this is it brought all the stakeholders in a way that truly was inclusive. It had many faults and many failings, but I think this is a major accomplishment that deserves to be recognized. However, it also led to a paralyzed government with this power-sharing arrangement that ultimately prompted no minister to take any real responsibility or demonstrate leadership. And this paralysis that prevented any movement on improving the delivery of services, dealing with electricity shortages, implementing an economic strategy, managing the prices of basic goods. The government was simply unable to really take any action in any domain, and this led to extreme frustration on the part of the population. At the same time, new actors that had come to the political playing field as part of the transition process did not feel fully represented. They had been part of the national dialogue, but they were not empowered in government. And this has led to the rise of the Houthi movement. If anyone is following Yemen closely will know all the details of this. For those of you who are not, Yemen is often off the radar, so I'm glad that it was highlighted in this panel. But part of what has transpired is the ability of the Houthi movement to capitalize on this frustration, on the sense that the political playing field had really not changed. What had happened is a slight shifting of elite alliances and elite power dynamics in the country, but really no new entrants. Same people were making the same decisions, just sitting in a slightly different configuration. And what is, I think, tragic about this occurrence is instead of, again, returning to the process of dialogue and consensus building to solve the problem, they resorted to the use of arms and violence. And this is sadly where we sit now, which is that the current violent conflicts that are transpiring throughout different parts of the country have really unraveled years of effort, the past 3 years and even predating that, effort to build consensus, dialogue, and legitimate institutions, political institutions that would help people articulate their needs and their desires and their grievances. And instead, we've seen a sort of regression. I would also note that part of what we're seeing is this, when faced with fear, really, at its most base level, people are resorting to tribal identity, to sectarian identity, and to sort of the most base or central part of what makes people feel secure and safe. And whether this is, again, tribal, religious, clan, family, it's a climate, it's evolving out of a climate of fear and violence. And so I think that this is unsurprising, and yet this is not really what is driving the core components of the conflict. It is not sectarian in nature. It is being exacerbated by using sectarian rivalries, but this is ultimately a struggle for power at its most base level. And until that's addressed, again, through dialogue and through political process, the violence will continue. And so I would just end by saying that I think in terms of how the United States and Europe and other international actors approach these countries in Libya, in Yemen, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, it really needs to be a two-part approach that is long-term in nature. One is a long-term investment in the establishment and strengthening of effective, strong state institutions. And the second is support for dialogue and real reconciliation between key stakeholders. What we're seeing, I think, in perhaps all of these countries is that weak and corrupt security institutions and the lack of reconciliation between former regime elements and new actors is what is driving the conflict. And this is what we need to tend to, and I think taking a step back to understand how our actions or inactions either strengthen or weaken various stakeholders, to take that into consideration and develop a holistic strategy about, again, returning to the core principles, building strong state institutions based on good governance, and a process of reconciliation is where we need to focus our attention.
Thank you very much. We are about to pass to Mr. Bangalanka, Chair of the Governing Board from SIPRI from Stockholm. Goran, you have the role.
Thank you for inviting me. It's the fifth time I'm in Tangier, and I must say I enjoy being at the MEDays because it gives at least me as a Northern European another perspective of many things. You need to be in other parts of the world and need to see things that sometimes you don't see it because you're also focused on your own way of seeing things. Could I remind you that failed states? There was a continent that was failed a couple of generations ago. It was called Europe. Totally destroyed. Not only destroyed materially, economically, but also morally. I mean, concentration camps and whatever. That was a whole continent. And that has to be rebooted. And it was. So I want to inject some sort of optimism here. This is not going on forever. There are things to be done. It does not need to be in the long term. I think change should be rather quick. Shock therapy was what we introduced in Europe 20 years ago, and those who really did shock therapy are the ones who are best of the new democracies in Europe today. If you look at some recent changes that have been rather successful, Central and Eastern Europe, certainly, not Yugoslavia, not Russia and Ukraine, but the one in between. We had a country called South Africa that had a fantastic change from a very cruel dictatorial regime, and Tunisia. And I think, first of all, what is a reason to the mess we see today in these states we are going to discuss? It is that in a dictatorship, the old regime creates powerful structures, repressive structures, because that is an essential part of dictatorship. You create powerful structures in society to repress people. Otherwise, you won't survive as a dictator. And that was certainly the case for the communists in Europe, for example. It was the white minority in South Africa. And we know the dictatorships of the countries we are going to speak of. Then comes the revolution. Then the critical thing in the revolutionary situation, when you shape or about to shape a democracy, is how do you ensure that those of the old power structure has the incentive to play with the change, not against it. And there I think Nelson Mandela was really the supreme thinker. He realized that the white minority must have the confidence in the new process, not be afraid of it, not trying to sabotage it, but they would have a nice future. Perhaps not as in the old time, not being, very different from the rest of the people of the country, but nevertheless not to fear it. Apart from a few at the top, of course, who were really criminals, but part of the power structure were ordinary human beings that just wanted, to have a decent life. Not perhaps with a very good conscience always, but nevertheless, not necessarily the real bad people. And what he did was to focus on saying to the white minority, in the new situation of South Africa, you will still be able to live a decent life. Other people will also have the possibility to lead a decent life. And I think that is internally the whole mentality. Sometimes you need support from abroad, from others, to do this, because this is difficult to do in reality, because there is a lot of hatred and very, very deep feelings if you lived in a dictatorship, which makes this process very difficult to do in reality, because revenge is a very strong human feeling. In Europe, back after the Second World War, the Americans helped us to do this. They even forced us Europeans to talk to each other. And nobody would, at that time, would to talk to Germans or Italians because they were the aggressors. But the Americans forced us to do that, to get money, the Marshall Aid. Brilliant idea, very brilliant. And then we started to talk to each other and realized that the guy on the other side was perhaps not that bad, at least not all of them. And I think to transform it to Tunisia, perhaps this is what Tunisia has managed to do. Not perfectly. Come on, there are no perfect countries in this world. But nevertheless, to see it that, yes, we have to include also the old bad elite, so to say, into the new process. But then, of course, it's also a responsibility for the outsiders to help and support in that. And now I come to my number 2 point, which is the outsiders. I guess I'm the only European in this panel, but there are 2 Americans. I won't speak about the United States. I think it's better for you to do that. But certainly, we from the outside could have done more. Particularly Europe should have done much more in this process. We had the campaign for Libya, for example, the air campaign, that helped, of course, to get rid of Gaddafi. Essentially, that was right. But we could have done much more. Instead of them saying, fine, goodbye, we'll leave, we should have engaged more financially, but perhaps also more politically, not politically in the sense they should sort of decide over things, but help reconciliation in the country, knowing that the country was divided, of course, because you had the old security elite that might be interested in sabotaging the changes. Exactly as we know it could happen in other places of the world I just spoke about. So I would say a more thorough engagement for Europe at that time. We didn't need the United States for that. The United States had other qualities and other problems as well. But we from Europe should certainly be engaged much more in Libya, if I take that example. We should, of course, if you look at Yemen, I think they have a strong economic neighbors in the GCC. They're more than $1 trillion economies together, Saudi Arabia and the 5 smaller. That's not a lack of money and lack of economic resources. Perhaps the problem there are they are also dictatorships, most of them. So perhaps they were not that willing to support a new democratic opening. We could have done more when it comes certainly to Syria, which I think is really a shame, because we decided 20 years ago after Rwanda that there is a responsibility to protect. That we did, all of us, the whole international community. We have a responsibility to protect, to see that innocent people are not killed massively, as they are done in Syria. And there, of course, the unwillingness of Europe, not least, to support in this. And I think that a no-fly zone would have been the proper starting point, at least. Perhaps something else, but at least to start with. And I think the Turkish were right in that. We should have done that. The problem there is, of course, our own inability to act in Europe. Usually we don't act without the United States, because the United States has been the leader since Second World War, more or less. But also a more inward-looking Europe since 2008, certainly. Partly because of the financial crisis, but also part of an inability to use the tools that we have in the European Union. I was myself part of building the new Treaty of Lisbon, where we actually did this because of the responsibility to protect, that we should have the instruments exactly not to repeat Rwanda, to put it that way. And we haven't used them. We haven't used them, which I think. I would also say a word about the Arab League, because there is one reason why Europe is careful. That is, of course, the colonial past. The Europeans have been colonialists. And to go back into areas where we have a colonial past, you need, so to say, a strong invitation. And what the necessary invitation back in 2011 in Libya was, of course, the Arab League. Because the Arab League invited, then you felt in Europe that, okay, this is not neo-colonial campaign. We are invited, we are welcome into the region. I think that the Arab League needs to be much more active, not necessarily performing everything itself, but to be the, so to say, give the legal basis for us outsiders to feel that, yes, we are doing this, we are welcome, we are not doing this for our own thing, but we are doing this to help. So there is a lot of criticism to us from the outside. Europe had been far too passive. We should have done much more, not least to speak also on the economic area. I won't go into that, but you know it. Europe could do much more for the Mediterranean area economically than we are doing. We have become rather protectionist, which is totally against the whole European history, because the whole idea of European integration was to be against protectionism, to open borders, to free flow, etc. And now we turned too protectionist, I would say. But I will stop there.
Thank you very much, Graham, for your very optimistic words in the beginning of your speech, and to help us to understand more complexity of this area and open our mind talking about South Africa and Rwanda, etc. I'm not sure that moral is involving the international relations, but it's a question. Well, we can now pass to Mark Hellenbogen, Chairman Global Panel Foundation. Maybe, Mark, I want to ask you first of all if you can help us to understand how US want to manage those conflicts. Thank you, Mark.
All right. Well, as some of you have seen me before, I'm not here speaking for the US government, and I'm even up for a senior position in the US government right now, so that complicates my life. Listen, I think the US, thanks, Deborah. I think the US government itself is having problems deciding what it wants to do. First, if you just take the last years, you had a president under President Bush who said 2 + 2 is 10. It's 10, it's 10. So we went forward and we said 2 + 2 is 10. And he was very proactive. Whether you disagree with him or not, he tended to make decisions and he pushed them through. Now you have a more thoughtful president, but a president who is torn between his different thoughts and torn between the approaches he wants to make, except that he does believe one thing, and that is that the U.S. should extract itself from most of these areas. So that's the kind of conflict that the U.S. is having. I mean, I don't want to talk about myself, but if you take my life as a military man, I think this way. If you take my life as a columnist, I think that way. If you take my life as a diplomat, this way. As an academic, somewhere else. So the U.S. is also now faced with those kinds of feelings. It is torn between the short term. Is it okay to get rid of Assad, but to possibly have ISIS in control? Is it okay to get rid of Hussein and have a government that might be more or less stable? It's probably true that both those countries are less stable. And then you've got the long term, which was talked about here very cogently and really in a lot of good ways, and especially on Yemen. I have to say I shouldn't open my mouth too much on them. And it is a forgotten conflict. And yet it's an important area also because the U.S. goes through the ports. And so now you're dealing with the long term, but governments always see things short term. So to answer this question, the U.S. has traditionally responded to these things based on our interest. What is best for us now? Is it better to support the dictator, Marcos, whoever it was over the years? And the one place where we began to do it differently was in Europe after World War II and the setup of the Marshall Plan. That kind of long-term thinking is clearly missing in this conflict. Let me just give you some numbers so you understand. We have spent $1 billion per week, $1 billion per week in 3 weeks fighting ISIS. I think that's kind of not a good investment. I think it's good to fight them, but the money can be used differently. We used to spend $45,000 per minute, fighting in Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan. The new number I just heard yesterday, you can correct me and somebody else, I understand we spent almost $3 trillion over the last years. So let me tell you what this means. In 10 years of fighting in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, in Iraq, we have spent more money than in the 45 years that we had 500,000 troops in Germany with all our bases, with all our commissaries setting up to prepare for the end of the Cold War. So if we took steps to invest, to put that kind of infrastructure in, it would be better. But the U.S. says, okay, this blueprint worked in Central and Eastern Europe. It worked in South America. Well, in many cases it didn't. And so I think the answer is taking a blueprint and putting it on top of one situation and saying, because it worked here, it's also going to work there, is one of the difficulties of being a big country like the U.S., which is spread extremely thin, which has a lot of internal problems itself. With Americans, only 18% of us have a passport. So in this last election, where the Republicans clearly defeated my party, of which I was a vice chair for 6 years, it is because Americans are very internal. We're not very good at looking beyond. Canada's the 51st state. Mexico's our slave labor. I'm sorry, just to make it a little cynical. And so looking beyond that is very difficult for your average citizen. It's even difficult for people like us who are in this. So what does the U.S. want to do vis-a-vis Syria and Iraq, Libya and Yemen? I would have followed a completely different strategy with Syria, and that was also recommended. Assad had approached the government through interlocutors, asked for a transition, but for a bribe. I think it was about $10 billion at the time. I don't exactly remember. I probably would have followed that, much to the chagrin of people who say, yes, but he killed 2,000 people. Yes, but he hadn't killed 100 million people, and he hadn't killed 200,000, and there weren't X millions of refugees. With Iraq, I personally agreed with going in after Saddam Hussein, but I'm biased because I had friends on Flight 103. Some of you might not remember that, so it's hard for me to think clearly, and I also lost family. With Libya, the same kind of thing. I mean, of course, Libya took the blame for this, but there were different players involved. So what I'm trying to say is the U.S. is inherently torn between short-term interest and between long-term interest, and we're caught in that right now. What do I think the president's going to do? He's dragging us into a non-winnable, non-sustainable conflict that's going to be kind of drip, drip, drip. So 3 months of pay, then another 3 months of pay, because what's going to happen is it will become long-term, but without a long-term strategy. That's my personal opinion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. It's a good transition because we have now one of our panelists, Anas Gomati, from Libya, and he probably can explain more about that. Thank you, Anas.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you to Amadeus Institute for having me here in Tangier for my second time. I think I'll begin in the same breath as many of the other speakers, and I'll add an insightful touch. I mean, 2 years ago, I was sitting in the other room, the main room, and was asked about the new phenomena that we're dealing with. And the new phenomena at the time was everyone exclaiming that arms proliferation, movement of weapons from Libya is so dangerous. And I said, well, most states have been able to. The international community has never had a huge problem with the movement of arms because they allow the movement of arms. It just depends to who. But the one thing that the international community won't stand for, not perhaps arms proliferation, but state proliferation. And I think that was the big question for me personally in 2012. It's an even bigger phenomenon, an even bigger question today in 2014. And so I thought I would do myself a justice, particularly as I can see myself on this camera, as making sure that I'm on the record as saying that is exactly how I think. That is what I think is, as an analyst and as someone that forecasts, I'd eat my hat otherwise. But I think that is going to be the main issue that we're dealing with, and I think that is the most comfortable way to begin a conversation about failed states. There is no dictionary or political science definition per se, or agreed upon definition as to what a failed state is. But when we're looking at Libya, I think it's quite interesting to think of Libya perhaps more so, and this is not a defense of Libya, this is just calling it what it is, but as an inherently weak state. What do I mean by it being weak? Well, there's 4,300 kilometers of border, some on sea, most by land, a population of 5 million, country bigger than most European countries put together. How do you go around managing, or rather, how do you go around controlling that border? What do you do about a border the size of Libya's border? That is a big question, because that border will become your biggest fear, your biggest weakness, and will make you inherently weak. How do we know where Egypt ends and where Libya starts, or rather where Libya ends and where Tunisia and Algeria start? Well, it's a question for the colonial powers 70, 60 years ago. But today it's a question again, and not to revoke Sykes-Picot, but we know that the same phenomena is occurring in Iraq and Syria. And I want to try and explain, or rather just explore what is happening. Why are we talking about failed states? Is it a political failure? I think to a certain degree it is, and I think that's something that is untenable, and I think we can look at 2010 and we can revisit that for whatever it was, but we can look at two parallel strands, or two parallel streams. What was happening politically had been the same way for a long time. As our earlier speaker mentioned, these are old regimes, they're like old machines, they only know how to act in one way. But when it comes to the socio-economic factors in these countries, now those things were changing. And there's been dramatic change, particularly over the last 20 years. But if we look over the last 60 years, the role of the state, just in historical terms, or the role of what the governor gives to those he governs, that's really dramatically changed as well. We talk about welfare states, and we talk about the way in which the state delivers basic services, local services. Now, those services had deteriorated, or the delivery of those services had deteriorated to the extent, or to the point where it was no longer tenable, or we could no longer call those governors as governing their own states. They weren't governing in the traditional sense they'd been governing for the last 60 years. Arab autocracy had no longer meant the same thing. We can talk about it as being, or we can talk about repressive stability if we'd like to, but in terms of, what do I get for that stability? I'm sitting in my small village on the eastern front of Libya. What do I get for all this repressive stability? Do I get water? Do I get electricity? Do I get jobs? Do I get food? I don't pay any tax, and we know that in the Arab world we don't pay tax. So if I don't pay tax, I don't own anything, but when it breaks, who fixes it? Now, that might sound like a very boring technical point, And to a certain degree it is. I'm not making a dispute about that. But it might be boring, but it's very relevant. Boring things are most often relevant. And I think, you know, to not bore anybody else with this question, if we look at Iraq and Syria, and we look at Iraq and Syria's borders, but we also look at, 2 years ago, actually 2.5 years ago, I sat with a member, I think it was of the Syrian Human Rights Observatory, and I have, you know, he's probably not here, but it was a very boring session. I remember I was almost half asleep until he mentioned one point, and he said, how do we know, and I asked him, I said, how do we know which area is under rebel control, and how do we know which is under the Bashar's control? And he said, well, you know, our metric for it is who pays their telephone bills. And I thought, wow, that's incredible. I mean, who cares about telephone bills in this day and age? And then he said, well, who pays their gas bills? And I thought, well, that's very interesting. You know, do you really control your territory if no one's paying their bills? Who's delivering those services? I live now today, I used to live in Libya. I've been living in Libya for the last 3.5 years, but I also live in Lebanon. And where I live in Lebanon, if you go to the north towards the Syrian border, who delivers electricity? Well, private suppliers deliver electricity. And in the rest of the Arab world that is now happening, a lot of private suppliers are providing generators. So if you only get 3 hours of state electricity, you've got another 21 hours in the day to fill that up. Who's going to provide that electricity? Well, in some cases it's a nice, nice man with a suit on. In other cases it's someone with military fatigues. But in Lebanon's case and in Syria's case today, and more often than not in Libya's case, you have this huge disparity. Some people charge you $50 a month for electricity, some charge you $400. A small community in the north of Lebanon were complaining about this last November 2013. Who came along? A small Islamist or jihadi group and said, okay, well, we can't really fight these guys because they're mafia, but we can threaten them and we can make them have one price for all. So what do? They have one price for all, the local community is happy, and they tax them for that. So who's in charge? Who's delivering the local service? Who's managing that local service? Salafi jihadi groups. It's a very boring point, but Salafi jihadi groups don't find it boring, so perhaps we shouldn't find it so boring. That's maybe the point that I'm trying to make. I mean, aside from demographic problems that we are facing over the last 30 years, this notion of local services, I guarantee you, I kid you not, is the most important factor and the most boring factor, but it is the most important factor as we look at Libya, as we look at Syria, as we look at Iraq. ISIS is not a new group. It's a new idea to a certain degree, but it's old wine, new bottles. And what I mean by this is that it's the same Salafi jihadism that we've been witnessing for the last 26, 27 years, particularly over the last 13, 14 years. But it's taking into consideration one vital point, the boring things that we don't talk about, the boring things like who delivers services, who's really in control, because Bashar al-Assad is not in control of a lot of Syria. And it's not because his posters aren't there, it's because he doesn't provide electricity, it's because he doesn't provide gas, it's because he's not able to a certain degree, allocate local services in terms of security, which we know that Salafi jihadi groups do, but they're now doing the boring work that we don't want to do. And in Libya, it's the very same case. Now, Libya has become the first satellite or the first colony of ISIS. Wilayat Barqa in the east of Libya, Darna in the east of Libya has become the first, satellite state of ISIS. Why? Because the state did not exist in any facet or any format for the last 2 years in Darna. Judicial police, the judiciary, local service providers didn't exist at all. So crucially, they took advantage of something that nobody else was doing. And the first thing they did was set up education offices and take over the courts. But they're also providing local services. Ansar al-Sharia and Benghazi, group popularly, quite well known and known for being involved in the murder of Ambassador Stevens 2 years ago. But what were they doing and why were they so popular? Because they were providing security for the local hospital, because on Eid al-Adha they were providing meat to poor families, to a certain degree taking advantage of the socio-economic factors, but they're also now providing, again, and doing the boring work that nobody else wants to do. How should we look at this notion of failed states? Political failure, feel free to look at it that way. I won't argue with you. We could get into that discussion. I don't think it's very fruitful. But I think in terms of what we can do, because more often than not, this question of, is Libya a failed state, is Syria a failed state, wouldn't it be better to just have Bashar al-Assad, wouldn't it be better to just keep Gaddafi? We're not facing those questions anymore. We're not facing the question of, could Gaddafi really control that? He wasn't controlling it, and in fact, his lack of basic understanding of governance and the delivery of local services led to what happened in the Arab Spring. As much as it was about dignity and human rights, no question about it, it was about the level and the level of life and the standard of life in a lot of these places. And if I'm not providing for you, then why should I stay with you? Ultimately, that's a good question. If Bashar al-Assad could take over the rest of Syria, fair play. If we're stuck in between, and I think it was a very good question that you're asking, Mark, if we're stuck in between this notion of do we keep Bashar or and then and hope for a better tomorrow, or do we get rid of him and look at ISIS? Maybe that question needs to be reformed. Perhaps we're to revisit that question and think perhaps ISIS is there not because of Bashar al-Assad, but because Bashar al-Assad can't control his territory, because Gaddafi couldn't control his territory, because Saddam Hussein, if you ask Iraqis, they were already losing their basic services for a long time. They were an impoverished country. Yes, they were a repressive country, but they were an impoverished country. So when we ask this question of, of failed states, the key point here is, are we facing the phenomena of ungoverned spaces? Ask any Nigerian in the room about Boko Haram, they'll tell you the same thing. Boko Haram has taken advantage of an ungoverned space. And Saudi Sharia are taking advantage in Libya of an ungoverned space. ISIS is taking advantage of ungoverned spaces in Libya, in Iraq and in Syria. They're very, very boring things, and I do a lot of boring things from my work, but I just thought it was a very valuable thing to come and share on this panel whilst I'm here. I won't go too much further on, but I will speak about Libya very briefly, and I talk about today's context and what is happening in Libya. To give you a brief scenario, everyone knows that the NATO intervention in March 2011, heralded the beginning of the downfall of Gaddafi's regime. Within 7 or 8 months, that regime had toppled. There has been a war of attrition ever since. But up until this year, there has been legislation passed, or rather last year in 2013, legislation passed, like in Iraq. So the de-Baathification law that was passed in Iraq some years ago has now been mimicked or copied in Libya, and we had the political isolation law, which was effectively the de-Gaddafication law. It removed remnants of the old state and went very, very deep. And today there is a fraction, or a fracture rather, within the country. You have remnants of the old regime that are, in league with, or rather, find a degree of similarity and objectives with other organizations that are anti-Islamist. And then you find Islamists with revolutionary factions, or factions that were hell-bent on bringing down Gaddafi, saying, well, we don't want you, so we'll work with the Islamists. And today, in fact, what you do have is 2 wars on terror. You have Operation Dignity in the east of Libya that began on May 15th of this year, and was preceded by this last year of the political isolation law. We don't have a role to play in the country, so we must go to war with these factions, and we'll do that under the pretext of saving Libya. We'll do that under the pretext of fighting terrorism, and we'll fight Ansar al-Sharia and we'll fight ISIS, but we may fight the Muslim Brotherhood, and we'll probably fight anybody else that gets in our way or keeps the political isolation law there as well. Now that's the leadership. I'm not talking about the leadership. I'm talking not about the support or about popular support, but just about the leadership. Then you can move to the west of the country, Operation Dawn that started in July of this year, or Qaswara, and then Fajr Libya. And that operation, the very same thing. Well, you're calling us terrorists? You want to have a war on terror? Okay, well, we'll have a war on terror and we'll call you terrorists. So that's a great way of getting into a never-ending battle. You're a terrorist, now I'm a terrorist, now he's a terrorist, now he's a... So it's one of those ones where you're thinking battle of language. And this narrative, this rhetoric, it's as useful as revolutionary rhetoric. Oh, the revolution, oh, the Arab Spring, or the Arab street, the street is all together. This is nonsense. I mean, the Arab street, I don't know if anybody else here buys this, but to think that we're all sheep sitting around saying, oh, well, I think we should all go all together, all 5 million of us thinking the same thoughts, and like cattle going towards I don't buy it for a minute. The Arab world is as diverse and as pluralistic as Europe. To talk about it in any other way is bigotry, and is bigoted rather than it's racist, and doesn't deserve any kind of credence or any kind of attention here. But in that sense, this notion that we can create these choreographed, the millions in Tahrir that only fits 250,000, but then you hear an Egyptian minister saying 40 million, 50 million. The IKEA furniture store has 690 million people there. Really? So then you hear all these numbers and you hear all these things. It's all choreographed. Sorry, the Swede in the corner, I don't want to upset anybody. IKEA, great place. But I am just saying, it was an exchange that I had with somebody about IKEA. That was a true statement. But ultimately, this notion that we can talk about, the hundreds of billions of Egyptians that emerged, where were they? Who are they? Libya, I know, has 5 billion people, but I hear about a protest that has 10 million or 20 million or 30 million. So I'm baffled by these numbers. It's choreographed. And it's choreographed for a reason, because it's powerful. That media narrative is extremely, extremely powerful. You can co-opt forces. And in a nation like Libya, and in countries that have undergone transitions, but have undergone civil wars, because revolutions are civil wars, let's call them that, the population is very polarized. You're either in one camp or another camp, which reminds me of what George Bush said, you're either with us or against us. There's a similarity there. And more often than not, you have a middle ground at the beginning of these conflicts, but then they become co-opted. And people start doing things that they normally wouldn't do. So in the east of Libya, if you're anti-Gaddafi's regime, the only people that represent you are the Salafi jihadi group called Ansar al-Sharia. You have young people in the west of Libya, young liberals, I might add, that wanted to have a democratic, future in the country, and are very, very much against Gaddafi's regime, but are now in the most stupid, baffling situation where the only militia, the only ground force, the only military force that represents them is Ansar al-Sharia, a Salafi jihadi group. It is a baffling situation, but polarized situations like this, wars on terror of this nature, they often put you in very baffling situations. So my final point is, and it's more of a question, because when we fight wars on terror, when we undergo these kind of conflicts, the real question we're asking, particularly when we're talking about failed states, Libya and outside of Libya, is not how do we kill a terrorist, not how do we get this deck of card approach to, well, we get, Osama bin Laden, then we get Zawahiri, then we might get Zarqawi. No, it doesn't work that way. For the last 13 years, we're looking at this virus and thinking, the very moment we think we're close to, getting the vaccine to get this virus, this lethal virus, it develops another strand or another strain. It's AQAP in the Arabian Peninsula, it's AQIM in North Africa, it's Ansar al-Sharia, tomorrow it's Daesh. And let's not forget ISIS. ISIS were rejected by Al-Qaeda for being too extreme. You're too extreme for us. Al-Qaeda is telling them to calm down. Do we realize how bad it has gotten in 2014 if Al-Qaeda is saying, can we show some restraint, please? Hey, this isn't all about cutting off heads here. This is the nature, and this is the world that we live in today. And the boring things that we're talking about, that we should be talking about, we don't talk about. We don't understand that we're trying to kill an idea. We don't understand for every bullet that we shoot against someone like bin Laden, we're creating more. These groups are growing. Ansar al-Sharia had 200 people in July 2012. Today it has over 5,000. ISIS had a couple of people sitting around calling each other kafara and calling each other heretics. And today it has thousands of people and it's recruiting from Europe. Why do we not understand how to kill an idea? You don't go around killing ideas. You don't kill them by bombing them out of existence. There is no bomb out there sophisticated enough to kill a beard or to kill an idea. Trust me. So I'll leave it there and I'll leave it open for questions, but I hope I shed some light on some very boring points.
Thank you very much, Anas. It was interesting, of course, but it was funny sometimes. Thank you too. Before to give the role to the floor, if you want to add something, Hasni.
Non, brièvement, parce que quand Anas a parlé des frontières, il y a beaucoup d'idées qui me sont venues à l'esprit. Je fais partie de ceux qui sont nés dans les années d'indépendance et on avait un seul souhait, c'était l'intégration du Maghreb. Je reviens parce que je suis maghrébin, que voir l'union du Maghreb arabe, le projet de l'unité arabe et probablement la Palestine. Aujourd'hui, je suis chagriné, mais triste, mais révolté contre l'héritage catastrophique des régimes autoritaires. C'est-à-dire aujourd'hui, on ne parle plus de Jérusalem, on ne parle plus d'un Maghreb arabe, on ne parle plus des États. On parle de Derna, on parle de Benghazi, on parle de Tripoli, on parle de division des États, on parle d'un État sunnite et un État alawite et un État aussi chiite. On parle aussi de l'Irak, de l'implosion de l'Irak, etc. Et c'est devenu presque un discours banal. Non seulement l'élite politique dans le monde arabe, mais aussi ailleurs. C'est-à-dire c'est devenu presque des scénarios qui sont tout à fait possibles. Et ça, j'ai quelque chose, si j'en veux vraiment à ces régimes qui nous ont chanté pendant des années le vœu de l'unité arabe, mais ils n'ont rien fait. Parce que l'unité arabe, au parler des États forts, passera d'abord par l'intérieur. je ne vous cache pas que j'ai beaucoup d'intérêt pour l'expérience marocaine sur le plan politique et le plan émotionnel, mais disons que pour le plan scientifique, c'est très intéressant. Et pour le public jeune présent ici, j'ai toujours dit que l'expérience marocaine, il faut la comprendre déjà dans les tractations. Monsieur le Président va me donner une minute supplémentaire dans les tractations entre Feu, Sa Majesté Hassan II et Youssouphi, dans cette idée-là, donc de l'alternance politique, malgré que le jeu n'était pas si ouvert. Et c'est très important. C'est un élément fondateur avant même le printemps arabe. Et je reviens à mon idée, celle qu'un régime fort peut déclencher un processus positif pour sécuriser, pour le pays, pour éviter l'implosion. Deuxième et très intéressante qu'il faut l'étudier, c'est la demande du Maroc. Je suis dans un institut européen. Quand le Maroc a demandé l'adhésion, évidemment, dans l'esprit de Hassan II, la réponse allait être non. Mais quand vous lisez le programme politique de l'AKP en Turquie, même vous revenez à l'histoire, à Atatürk, comment il a fondé une Turquie avec des nations. Si en offrant quelque chose, un projet, la Turquie va devenir un État-nation très fort. Et deuxième objectif, nous allons embrasser l'Europe. Ici, c'est ça, je reviens à la balle à l'Union européenne qui n'a pas compris. Et s'il y a des États qui ont failli, c'est parce que aussi il y a des politiques européennes qui ont failli. C'est une faillite, une double faillite à l'échelle nationale de l'espace arabe, mais aussi de l'Europe, qui on regarde toujours du côté de l'Europe, et c'est normal, c'est notre proximité. Et je me souviens, j'ai fait un débat il y a 3 ans dans une télévision française, et on a parlé du printemps arabe. Et évidemment, le journaliste, il me dit, finalement, M. Abidi, avec le Maroc, il s'en sort bien. Je lui dis oui. Évidemment, c'était à l'époque où beaucoup de mes amis marocains m'ont dit il faut faire attention, faut faire quelque chose parce que nous avons un journaliste marocain qui est en prison. J'ai dit oui, le Maroc s'en sort bien. Il a fait beaucoup de choses, mais le Maroc n'a pas attendu le printemps arabe pour amorcer un petit peu ce changement en douceur, un changement encadré, encore une fois, une transition encadrée. J'ai dit oui, il y a des journalistes qui sont en prison, il faut absolument changer le code de la presse, c'est très important, parce que les médias, c'est un contre-pouvoir important. Et à côté de moi, il y avait un éminent juriste, historien français, il me dit, Monsieur Abidi, mais tout de même, laissez-nous au moins un pays où on peut aller en vacances, c'est le Maroc. Et ça m'a rappelé l'idée des frontières, parce que même dans un espace qui bouillonne, ce matin, je disais à Kader que finalement l'Algérie, avec la Tunisie et la Libye, elle supporte un fardeau sécuritaire très important. Vous imaginez si vous n'avez pas des forces de sécurité importantes, et le Maroc aussi, comme rôle qu'il joue, pour sécuriser, pour alléger un peu le fardeau énorme sur la Tunisie. Et Anas a parlé de ces frontières libyennes. J'en conclus par une chose, c'est que ce matin, vous avez tous entendu comme moi, une autre dérive, c'est bien sûr de réduire un peu certains conflits importants qui ont des causes endogènes mais exogènes. Quand l'ancien ministre français parle par exemple de Kobané, moi je suis révolté. Parce que les Syriens, vous savez aujourd'hui, qui sont réfugiés en Jordanie, ils ont une petite blague, ils disent vous savez où se trouve la Syrie? Elle se trouve au sud de Kobané. C'est-à-dire, pour eux, ce n'est plus la cause syrienne, ce n'est plus une histoire vraiment d'émancipation, ce n'est plus une histoire de justice, de revenir chez eux. Toute l'histoire, tout le conflit et la complexité de la crise syrienne est résumée à une histoire de Kurdes et donc à Kobané contre l'État islamique. Et c'est comme ça qu'on a réduit, c'est comme ça qu'on gère mal et c'est comme ça qu'on voit mal. C'est vrai, moi je suis d'accord avec ce qui a été dit, je pense que même l'Occident lui-même est en panne de projets, est en panne de politique. Il n'arrive pas comment gérer. Il expérimente certains projets pour comment relever et aider ces États. Je suis triste et je le dis souvent, le seul projet aujourd'hui entre l'Europe et le monde arabe, c'est Daesh. Il n'y a aucune initiative. Avant de venir à Tanger, j'ai entendu parler que Serge Tel, donc, qui est responsable de l'Union pour l'EPM, la France va décider bientôt de fermer l'antenne de l'EPM à Paris. C'est-à-dire que la France ne croit même plus à ce projet, l'EPM de Sarkozy. Donc vous imaginez, on parle toujours de l'importance à ce dialogue, ce projet de soutenir les transitions économiques. Je ne reviens pas au plan Marshall qui a été bien sûr promis par Zapatero. Finalement, le plan Marshall est allé à Madrid. Mais beaucoup de choses comme ça qui n'ont rien été faites. La sécurité et l'économie, la création de l'emploi très important. Et c'est sur 2 projets, on a dit à ces pays-là, allez-y, débrouillez-vous, ou probablement l'intervention a été mal faite. Donc il y a une responsabilité à mon avis. Comment relever ces États? On sait que les causes sont énormes, sont grandes et que ça prendra du temps, mais il est aujourd'hui, avant-demain, urgent pour qu'il y ait vraiment un dialogue, pour qu'il y ait vraiment une coopération entre l'Europe, les États-Unis, pour dire comment faire. La guerre de Haït, elle coûte cher, mais il ne faut pas oublier qu'une grande partie de ces ressources viennent des pays du Golfe. Donc je ne comprends pas comment peut-on financer ou aider à la création de ce monstre, et ensuite on passe la caisse, et après on y blanchit. Ça, je trouve que c'est tout de même aberrant, mais encore une fois, il n'y a pas d'éthique dans les relations internationales, hélas.
Merci, Hasni. Dania, you want to add something? Okay. Mark? Ok. Alors, je vous demande juste de vous présenter et de dire à qui vous souhaitez poser votre question. Le micro, s'il vous plaît. Là, juste devant moi, ici.
Bonjour, je suis le colonel Hassan Saoud, consultant et analyste en stratégie. Je remercie les panélistes pour avoir embrassé un peu toute la question. Je rappellerai tout simplement que dans les pays que vous avez visés, l'Occident est passé par là. Et j'aimerais bien que M. Hassan m'en parle. Irak, 2003, échec. 2009, double échec. Libye, coalition franco-britannique, échec. Afghanistan, échec. Il n'y a que la Tunisie qui s'est débrouillée toute seule, qu'on voit, pour laquelle on est content. Donc je voudrais poser la question à M. Hasni. Est-ce que vous ne pensez pas que l'Occident doit cesser de faire du prêt-à-porter politique et connaître davantage des articulations sociales et toutes les imbrications pour pouvoir agir en conséquence? Et pour M. Marker, est-ce qu'il n'est pas temps que l'Europe cesse d'être un grand marché et devenir un acteur stratégique majeur? C'est ce que nous demandons. Et pour M. que pensez-vous de cette coalition aux intérêts divergents où des gens font de la figuration? Je vous pose la question parce que vous êtes censé en être le leader. Turquie, Fassad, tous les acteurs régionaux n'ont pas la même feuille de route. Est-ce qu'elle est-elle viable à votre avis? Et je vous remercie.
Mark, you want to start to answer? Thank you. Yes, Goran, of course.
No, I'm not sure it's a reliable coalition. It's probably difficult to be a reliable coalition when 3 of the partners in the coalition were also the primary monetary sponsors of ISIS. And since I don't want to annoy people in the room, you can ask me later who I mean. And I want to add a strength to what you said before. You know, Hamas won because Fatah had become so corrupt and they were delivering local services, and that's why they were voted into power. Yeah, no, I agree. So that's so no. I think the divergent coalition will become an extremely difficult thing, and it's why I said before we're being dragged into a long-term situation here without a strategy. Does that answer your question, or did you want me to answer it differently? No, I didn't mean you. I meant, Colonel, did you want me to answer it more detailed? Sorry, I didn't mean that. Anyway, thank you. Shukran.
Yeah, the whole idea, of course, of the European Union was first of all to solve the European problems, our internal problems, which were huge. Europe was the source of most of the violence during the 20th century. But then the idea, of course, to be able to, not least, to help and support in the neighboring areas to Europe, to the east and to the south. That's why we have neighbors. And we, I would say, reasonably well succeeded to the east, with exceptions. But nevertheless, with a strong engagement in all matters, I would say, particularly building economic and social development, because that is, and that is your point, of course, that economic and social development has to follow political change. We said that we was interested in doing that also to the south. That was the whole idea about the MED in the different versions. We had different versions in the EU. But it was not really put in place because of protectionist forces in Europe. Protectionist forces are rather strong, particularly in times of economic difficulties. And particularly the countries to the south of Europe, who in a way should be most interested in economic support to the south, on the other hand, were rather afraid of economic competition, olives or whatever, grapes or things that could be imported from south of the Mediterranean. So we had a rather dual policy in reality. Europe focuses a lot on civil things. Europe of today has never had spent less on defense than we do today. About 1.5% of our combined economy in Europe is spent on defense. That is the lowest in European history ever.
Is that good?
That is debatable, but certainly that is a reality. We have never had fewer soldiers in proportion to our population than we have today. At least not since before the Napoleonic Wars. So Europe, in that sense, has relied on the United States for the strategic protection, as always, but also seen that there are no really military threats in the vicinity of Europe. Now Russia is changing that to the east. But the idea was, of course, then to be able to also, as I said, to do what after Rwanda, to be able to have this intervention, humanitarian intervention. That does not lead a lot of advanced things, but some basic things. And we haven't even utilized that really. We could have done that for Libya, for example, to follow on after the air campaign. That would have been the proper way of doing it. And particularly, as you say, focus not so much on military things, but on development of social services, etc. We are pretty good at that. Europe spends half of the world's spending on social expenditure is Europe. So that is certainly an area where Europe has a lot of experience, and that's what we experience also through Central Eastern Europe. You have to have, of course, good social services accompanying democratic reforms. That's a very important part of it, otherwise you lose credibility.
Thank you, Hassan. Je peux répondre brièvement. Merci.
Ça va être difficile de répondre brièvement, parce que c'est un sujet que j'aime bien, de parler de l'Irak. Sincèrement, je vais laisser ma casquette d'universitaire, mais je vais parler en tant que citoyen arabe surtout. Moi, je trouve qu'il devrait exister un tribunal pour juger un homme qui s'appelle George Bush, un homme qui coule une retraite paisible qui s'appelle Paul Bremer, au sud de la France, et un homme comme Tony Blair aujourd'hui, qui a menti, qui a fait passer un rapport par, retenez bien le nom, Alistair Campbell, son chef de communication, et qui a une société aujourd'hui et qui conseille les pays arabes. Et je ne comprends pas que Tony Blair, il arrive à trouver avec tous ses mandats, puisqu'il est devenu aujourd'hui l'homme qui fait la promotion de régime de coup d'État en Égypte. Je ne comprends pas que ces hommes-là circulent encore en liberté. Je reviens pour dire que l'Irak, c'était tout de même la première fracture. C'était d'abord parce qu'on a carrément, j'allais dire, on a fait une guerre injustifiée. Et deuxièmement, je ne parle pas des arguments utilisés. Souvenez-vous, c'était passé par un grand centre de recherche pour dire, à l'époque, je me souviens, j'étais étudiant, on nous disait que, je préparais ma thèse, que l'Irak était prêt de Saddam à charger ses missiles nucléaires au bout de 15 minutes. Ensuite, vous avez vu les rapports et toutes les enquêtes, ils ont montré que pas du tout. Il n'y a pas de lien entre Saddam et les terroristes, et il n'y a aucun lien, et l'Irak n'avait pas la capacité d'armer nucléairement, en tout cas, ces missiles. Donc l'Irak, c'est vrai que c'était l'effondrement de cet État-là, évidemment, le manque de cette compréhension. Vous savez, il faut dire aussi qu'il y avait beaucoup d'Américains, surtout des diplomates, qui étaient contre cette intervention, et qui connaissent le monde arabe. Attention, parce que l'Amérique, c'est grand. Mais il y avait une autre partie, je ne veux pas parler d'une nuance un peu, les sédio-conservateurs, qui disaient, oui, we can do it. On peut amener la démocratie en Irak, et vous avez vu que ce qu'on a amené, on a amené l'anarchie et le chaos. Donc vous avez raison, l'Irak, c'était l'acte fondamental numéro 2, bien sûr, après l'Afghanistan, et je crois ce qu'on vit aujourd'hui, bien entendu, est la conséquence directe de ce qui s'est passé en Irak.
You want to add something, Mark? Sure. Thank you.
I mean, I agree with a lot of what you said, but there is clearly a link between Saddam Hussein and terrorism. I don't know how you can even say that. It's absolutely not factual. He was supporting terrorist groups. He was supporting he was destabilizing a lot of institutions in a lot of places.
You're talking about first Iraq war,
yes,
or the second?
Well, that's a fair question. Which one is he referring to? Well, I think even then it was comme ci, comme ça, but yes, my comments were from the beginning of when he was ousted.
Thank you.
Oui, monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Vendredi from the Amadeus Institute in Madrid. I have
Thank you.
Marc.
There were negotiations going on behind the scenes in which Assad made it clear that he was interested in finding a transition. The Bush administration ignored that entree. It was through a third country. And then the Obama administration dropped the ball for a variety of reasons, partly because it was a new government. But yes, the offer was made that if he could leave his country with X amount of money, I defined it as 10 billion, he would be prepared to find a transition from where it was going to a new step. And I do believe, had we taken that on, that we wouldn't have the chaos we have today. That's my answer. No policy to the Middle East. Well, if you heard me this morning, I already said I don't think the United States is leading enough in the Middle East and in a lot of places. You know, I am a U.S. citizen and I speak American English, but the fact is I was born in Germany. And I spent my youth in Germany, and then in Canada, and then the U.S. So why am I saying that? Because I think differently. I think having a proactive policy is very important. And one ace where I disagree, I think sometimes there are philosophies, whether it's communism or fascism or Nazism. I'll speak about Nazism as unfortunately coming from a family who participated in that crap, which doesn't make me very proud, that sometimes you do have to cut off the head of the snake to stop a philosophy to prevent greater good from, or greater bad from being put forward. Paralysis, I think President Obama is partly to blame for the paralysis. He has bright young campaign staffers, but they also try to run the White House. They know how to win campaigns, but they don't know how to run government. And I sometimes joke with my students that the adults were marginalized.
Yes, Daniel.
I just wanted to add one point on the question about whether or not the United States has a strategy. I mean, I think there's been a lot of critique in the United States for the lack of strategy in terms of the U.S. approach to the Middle East. And part of what's coming about now, I think, is a bit more soul-searching on that. And the increasing level of engagement in Iraq and Syria, I think, is, as Mark noted, a sort of backdoor entry into a much deeper and more sustained engagement than anyone would have thought or wanted. And this is creating a policy without a strategy. And this is, I think, under fierce and critical debate inside the United States about how to transform a much less perfect situation into some sort of strategy that will actually achieve the United States' stated strategic objectives. What we are doing now is clearly not that. And I think your question is very apt and very poignant and is really at the heart of a lot of debate inside Washington. There's been, I think, a lot of well-warranted critique about the lack of a strategy. And for better or for worse, though the inclination of the administration and the president may have been to try and have our engagement at arm's length, I wouldn't necessarily to extricate entirely, but to do as little as possible, is clearly not feasible. we simply are incapable and unable to do that for various pressures and various reasons. And so without a strategy, we're, for lack of a better example, we're sort of throwing spaghetti at the wall to see what sticks, but without really having a strategy to get to our objectives. I would just note there was an article today, I think in the Post or the Times, that the recent campaign in Raqqa in Syria that is helping to dislodge ISIS has been successful in weakening ISIS's control on it, but is angering the local population and the local constituency for exactly the reason that Anas pointed out, which is they were providing basic services, they were providing control and security. And so we've now just destabilized yet again without sufficient attention again to the whole ecosystem of what's going on. And our strategy has to be based on that kind of analysis and that kind of understanding. Until it is, we simply will never get any closer to achieving our real objectives.
Thank you, Daniel. Goran, you want to add something? Short and quick, please.
It would be helpful for both the United States and Europe if we had some guidance from the Arab world. I think that the Arab League has a role to help us to shape a strategy.
Thank you. Anas?
I know we've spoken a lot about the European role, and I do, I commend the idea of a Marshall Plan for the Arab world, but let's not kid ourselves. The European Union has been facing economic Armageddon tete-a-tete for the last couple of years. And whilst the Arab countries, count their aid need in billions, the European countries are probably closer to providing that in millions. So I think there is a big gap, there's a big void. I would love to talk about the Arab world in terms of the fall of the Iron Curtain and providing a new tomorrow and being involved again. But let's not kid ourselves. The Arab world has firmly no place in Europe. There may be trade deals there, and it's more for more idea and repackaged idea and old wine and new bottles is not going to sort out needed problems there. The Arab actors, however, be very clear about this. The GCC, for example, doesn't mind giving billions. It doesn't mind giving billions for the wrong reasons as well. So let's understand very quickly. But the Arab actors are actually involved to a certain degree. And let's look at Libya. There is a proxy war going on in Libya amongst two Arab countries, the UAE and Qatar. It's very simple equation. Libyans are fighting that battle. They're losing their country day by day. But the GCC are in charge. But do they ever make statements? Never. Who makes statements? European Union. European Union loves coming out and talking about Libya. The States loves coming out and talking about Libya, but they're not involved. It's nothing to do with them. They have absolutely nothing going on in Libya. It's a joke to the degree which, if we still speak about Europe as being an actor, or if we speak about the States being an actor or as an important actor as beforehand, I think I probably agree towards Mark's description and diagnosis, which is simple. You will become an actor because at one point, all the bad options that you could have taken will no longer be there, and you will have absolutely no options left until the point where you have to go back in again. And so I agree, perhaps it's not palatable at the moment for the US to be in the Middle East. And I think the Arab world has to get its act together as well. The Arab world doesn't understand. It says, where are you? Why are you coming to save us? And then when they do come and try and save, they say, look at all the political meddling again. It's neocolonialism. What do you want? What do you want? Can we get a clear narrative? I'll leave it there. Go on.
Sorry, thank you. We get to more questions and then we have to get over because it's really late now.
Jawad Kardoudi, Institut marocain des relations internationales. Alors, moi, je regrette que l'Égypte n'ait pas été incluse dans ce panel, car j'estime que l'avenir de l'Égypte est également incertain, car contrairement à la Tunisie, qui a essayé d'avoir un dialogue avec les islamistes, il faut le dire carrément, en Égypte, le régime actuel veut éradiquer les frères musulmans. Alors j'aimerais avoir le point de vue de mon ami M. Abidi et M. Marc également pour les États-Unis. Quel avenir pensez-vous pour l'Égypte? Merci.
Merci Sidjawed. Derrière toi, il y a un monsieur qui demandait la parole. Question courte, merci.
Moi je vais être très bref.
Vous pouvez vous présenter?
Ousmane Sissé, je suis citoyen français d'origine subsaharienne et je représente ici une organisation qui s'appelle le CRAN, Conseil représentatif des associations noires de France. fédération d'associations, voilà. Un petit peu l'équivalent de la LICRA en France, et un peu l'équivalent de SOS Racisme. Alors, je suis dans cette rencontre internationale depuis 2-3 jours. J'écoute beaucoup de choses, beaucoup de spécialistes qui vous découpent à l'intérieur de quoi sont faits les conflits, les différentes communautés qui se combattent. Mais ma question essentielle, c'est les questions qu'a posées le représentant de la Libye tout à l'heure. Qui fournit l'énergie? Qui fournit la nourriture? Est-ce que le problème essentiel de toutes ces populations qui, à un moment donné, quittent leur coin, sont obligés de partir, ce n'est pas tout simplement la recherche du minimum vital, qui passe à travers un minimum de nourriture, un minimum d'énergie? Est-ce que ce ne sont pas les véritables questions? Et quand ils posent la question, qui fournit l'énergie? Qui nourrit? Qui donne les moyens? Si on allait derrière cette question-là pour voir qui ralentit l'autonomie des populations à travers leur capacité à autoproduire leur propre énergie dont elles ont besoin, qui aujourd'hui ralentit le processus d'énergie renouvelable qui permettrait l'accès aux populations pauvres d'une énergie beaucoup plus adaptée à leurs moyens? Quand on se pose ces questions, qui, peut-être qu'on est en train d'approcher les véritables problèmes et les véritables blocages dont sont victimes toutes les minorités, quelles qu'elles soient, qui sont à la recherche du minimum vital, de l'eau pour manger, de l'eau pour boire, de la nourriture pour se nourrir et une sécurité. Moi, je suis citoyen, mais je reconnais un État à partir du moment où cet État a la capacité de me protéger, de me donner à manger, de me donner à boire. À partir de ce moment-là, je reconnais cet État-là. Et c'est le phénomène qu'il a expliqué tout à l'heure par rapport à l'humanité. Posons-nous les vraies questions pour trouver les vraies réponses.
Merci. Anas, you want to start by this question, which is probably also an answer?
Who's providing the energy? Who's providing the food ultimately? Yeah, when you were saying this, I was thinking to myself, could one day history call ISIS the most militant extremist humanitarian organization in history? Who knows? Because Al-Qaeda wasn't providing food, but ISIS is. If you look at their AGM report, their annual general report, right? You look at that and it tells you that annual general meeting. They have this big report that they publish, and it tells you about, it shows pictures of them delivering food to different places and, encouraging citizens to come to, the Islamic State because they're providing food. If I understood your question correctly, it's who is behind all this, who's providing this. It's the, it's a good question. I would love to be able to say, oh, it's him. I know him as well. Let me give him a call. I'll tell him to stop it. It's not as simple as that. Ultimately, people, via proxy are often working with organizations like that. But I've said, and I'll make it very clear, the difference with IS, or the difference with Daesh is that they're a self-sustaining organization, that they understand the need to be independent from different powers that one day will support them and then one day leave them. And so they understand the need to be involved in, yes, working with basic services, but also they talk about tax. If you look at Mohammed al-Maqdisi's work in Jordan, for example, he's the ideologue, the scholar behind a lot of this work. He talks about the needed jihad, but he talks about jihad al-tamkin, the jihad to consolidate. And he's saying that we fight only when we have to fight, but we're consolidating ground. We're trying to get ground here. And when you get ground and you can govern, you can also tax. And if you're not an Arab country that taxes, you're not an Arab country that will last for a long time. So to answer your question shortly, these are the new militant extremist humanitarian organizations. Bienvenue en 2014.
Thank you, Enes. Mark, about Egypt. Mark? Your microphone, please.
Thank you. Having had all other strategies fail, having had the concept of the Arab Spring or awakening not work, the U.S. chose to back Mr. ISIS as the least of the worst options to have Egypt become stable. In doing so, it benignly neglected its own values in accepting how the Muslim Brotherhood was treated, that bearing in mind that the U.S. strongly disagreed with the Muslim Brotherhood. But it didn't like the methods used to get rid of them. But it stood by. So it's a critique that I accept, and I don't have an answer except that the U.S. decided at that point that the new president was more important than him following democratic rules. And that's not an official government statement. That's my personal opinion of why we did it.
Thank you.
I want to cover one thing. You know, there's a bit of cynicism in your question. Of course, multinationals and lots of companies go into poor countries and set up structures for telephone, and control it. So that's a bad thing. The question would be, how do you invest? And I do think your critique on us is a bit unfair, the Europeans. They invest an enormous amount of money, even in Libya, through NGOs, but the money isn't through NGOs, but the money isn't getting anywhere. It's not staying behind. So that's your fair, so that's a fair critique. Look, if much of the money that we invested in the Iraq War in those 10 years in trying to build up and doing a bad job of it, infrastructures that actually stayed in Iraq, it would be a much better place. But the fact is a lot of it went to Iraq and then came back to the United States.
Please, Hasni, pour conclure. Merci. Oh, Dania first, you want one? No. No, please, Dania. Go ahead.
I just wanted to make one sort of closing comment to tie together 3 different points that were made that I think is absolutely essential, which is this question about delivery of basic services, and you sort of characterize this as being very boring and technical. I think this is actually the heart of the issue, because it connects to what you referred to about where is political legitimacy. And this is really what's at stake right here, is the struggle for who has political legitimacy and how do you get it. You get it by actually delivering things for your constituents. You get it from providing for what they need. Until the kinds of institutions and state structures that we hope would succeed on democratic principles are able to do that, then these kinds of groups will always find safe haven and find gaps and find space to proliferate. You see it with AQAP. They're also providing things. They're also protecting people. You find it with all these other groups. So what we should do is, as Mark said, how much money did we spend in the last 3 in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iraq? That money should be utilized to actually help build functioning state institutions that can deliver good governance that's clean without corruption, and facilitate the development of being able to provide for citizens.
Hasni, you want to conclude and answer to Jawad shortly, please.
Brièvement, merci si Jawad pour la question. Évidemment, la transition, comme vous le savez, elle se fait par l'inclusion et jamais par l'exclusion. Je dirais même que finalement, l'expérience égyptienne, en dépit des erreurs commises par les frères musulmans en Égypte, si on avait laissé le temps, en tout cas pour les Égyptiens, ils auraient probablement eu la même expérience que les Tunisiens. Et les Égyptiens, ils auraient voté pour les élections prochaines pour dire les islamistes, out, vous avez échoué. Et à leur décharge, les frères musulmans, on ne peut pas sortir un mouvement des cadres qui n'ont jamais, c'est-à-dire qui étaient dans l'opposition, dans l'exil, etc., et leur demander des miracles dans un pays qui a plus de 80 millions. Et pourtant, la sentence était terrible pour moi. On envoie du coup un message qui est très mauvais, ça veut dire que la démocratie ne marche pas. Et ça, c'est très important, parce que l'intégration de l'acteur islamiste, c'est-à-dire des mouvements à référents religieux, est la meilleure réponse pour les autres acteurs, c'est-à-dire ceux qui ne croient pas en Ansar Bayt al-Maqdis aujourd'hui, et d'autres mouvements qui n'ont jamais cru justement dans le jeu démocratique. Les frères musulmans, ils ont fait évidemment cette révision sur eux-mêmes qui a commencé depuis des années, et malgré ça, on leur a dit non, vous n'avez aucune place. Donc c'est pourquoi oui, l'Égypte, c'est vrai qu'elle va connaître malheureusement une situation très difficile, et ça va continuer. L'argent des pays du Golfe pour financer, il faut le dire, honnêtement, financer un peu ce coup d'État est une mauvaise chose, c'est un mauvais service qu'on donne, parce qu'un pays ne peut pas vivre comme ça avec des aides étrangères. Il faut absolument qu'ils arrivent plutôt à consolider. La consolidation interne, elle passe par l'intégration de tous les acteurs politiques. Je conclue par dire un mot, puisque le sujet c'est comment aider ces pays à se relever. Évidemment, il y a l'expérience positive du Conseil de coopération du Golfe, au CCG au Yémen, etc. Mais je reviens à la Libye. L'Algérie a donné, je reviens toujours au Maghreb, excusez-moi, c'est une obsession pour moi. L'Algérie a donné un soutien pour la Tunisie de l'ordre d'entre 50 et 100 millions de dollars. Pourquoi attendre des pays du Golfe qui viennent, par exemple, soutenir ou disons que devenir acteurs en Libye? La Libye, ce n'est pas un pays africain, ce n'est pas un pays maghrébin. Est-ce que le Maroc ou est-ce que l'Algérie n'ont pas assez de moyens pour soutenir ce pays? Parce que finalement, ce vide-là et l'ingérence de ces pays-là qui ont d'autres objectifs à part soutenir la population et la consolidation de processus démocratiques, je dirais plutôt qu'ils travaillent contre ce processus démocratique, puis ils n'arrivent pas contre eux, est très mauvaise. Il faut la combattre. Et la communauté internationale doit dire, j'espère que Bernardo de Leon, qui était là d'ailleurs il y a 1 an et 2 ans, fera ce diagnostic, c'est-à-dire que l'ingérence étrangère est la mauvaise conseillère pour une transition inclusive. Les pays du Maghreb, les pays arabes, oui, peuvent aussi faire quelque chose pour soutenir en tout cas ceux qui veulent se relever et aider ceux qui veulent justement arriver seuls, parce qu'on l'a bien vu par ailleurs, finalement ce qui vient de l'étranger n'est toujours pas bon, surtout, et on sait que les visées ne sont pas toujours en tout cas celles que pense la population. Merci.
Merci. I want to thank all of our panelists and again to thank the organization to give us the opportunity to talk about this subject. Thank you very much. Bon appétit.